And welcome, as Jimmy was saying, to the world premiere of Sir Thomas Stoppard's one-woman show, Penelope, which is a character that has intrigued readers and artists and artistic people for literally thousands of years. You know the story very well. Odysseus' wife, who was abandoned by her husband when he went off with those 1,000 ships to get the world's most beautiful woman, Helen, back from the Trojans and the Trojan seducer, Paris. Odysseus certainly took his time, as you know, getting back to Penelope. I mean, some excuses were good. You know, I'll buy Scylla and Charybdis, I'll buy the Cyclops. Calypso, I don't know, the beautiful nymph, Nausicaa as well. Perhaps he enjoyed some of his sojourns rather more than Penelope might have liked. And before we begin our discussion, it's worth remembering that the Odyssey and the Iliad are the very first works of Western literature thought to have been written about 700 BC. When I was at university, we thought it was 1000 BC, but scholarship now places it more recently. And in the West, if you think about it, for the next 1,000 years, the only written literature was in Latin and Greek. So before we get a chance to see Hattie Morahan's performance of Penelope. We've had a little preview. You're going to enjoy it so much. We're going to begin with a discussion about Penelope and how she has been interpreted down through the ages with my guests. And I just wanted to begin, first of all, with you, Tom, and just tell us a little bit about the genesis of your Penelope. How did that come about?
It came about as a plea from a friend, really, or a couple of friends. Penelope, for us tonight, is a monologue for an actor. It lasts not very much more than 20 minutes. And the reason that it exists at all is that Renée Fleming asked her friend, André Previn, to ask me, and as it turned out, to nag me for years, to write something for her to sing. And I kept saying, but I have no idea how to write for a singer. I've never done it. I don't know what the rules are, and so on. And they persisted. André persisted especially and said, look, just write it like a monologue in a play. I suspect that's not the whole answer to my question, but that's pretty much what I did. And finally, after a long time, and mainly to get myself off the hook, I said, okay, I'll do something. And there was a vague idea that I'd do it before the end of whatever year that was. And I think it was actually about 5 years ago.
That's quite a powerful pincer movement, isn't it? Renée Fleming
absolutely.
and André Previn. It's an offer you can't refuse.
That's right. And of course, I was just thinking in terms of writing a speech for sort of, a character in a play, a strong woman or an interesting woman or an important woman. And it could have been Joan of Arc or Virginia Woolf. And nothing really sparked me. I kept worrying about it. Emily Dickinson was a moment as well. So when I finally thought about Penelope, then I really felt, I could do something. I'm sure I can do something. I didn't have to do very much in the sense that, there was a well-known story already, and I had to, as it were, take it on board and hope that a lot of it was self-explanatory. But in the end, I did write this piece for a singer, and she sang it at Tanglewood in, I think, probably 3 or 4 years ago. This is the first time the piece has been spoken in England. And Hattie Morahan, who's very kindly been reading it and going through it with me a little bit, she'll do it to follow us. So that's kind of the short version.
And I suppose that the difference between this and the performance at Tanglewood is there isn't the music, which will give the audience more of a chance to focus on the words, which isn't always the case when words and music are combined.
What an agreeable way of putting it, yes. At Tanglewood, it's a symphony orchestra. And I'm modestly sitting there saying, speak up, André had died, sadly, within the previous year, so it was an in memoriam event. And I hope that, one day its music will return to it. There'll be a kind of reuniting of music and words. But meanwhile, I feel jolly pleased to have this piece out in the world now as a piece which speaks for herself. I was
And
really
you won't be having
interested to read what Emma wrote on the back of the leaflet. I hope as the conversation develops, I won't turn out to have got the thing completely wrong.
No heckling during the monologue, Emma. Well, I mean, Tom talked about this. It's this very well-known story. And I wanted to bring you in here just to remind us of, well, on the surface at any rate, who is Penelope in Homer? I mean, this very virtuous woman.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to start on a bit of a tangent, just going back to the words and song reuniting, one interesting thing is that in original Homeric epic was put to song. So Penelope would have originally been sung. So just as something for the future. But so in terms of getting Penelope right or wrong, is kind of impossible to do either, because on the surface, and so kind of talking about what she does right, on the surface she's quite easy to summarise. She is the quintessential wife, the stay-at-home wife. She's the paradigm of virtue. She's kind of well known for kind of two things really, her wisdom and her constancy, her fidelity. She's beset from the very start of the Odyssey on so many sides by the suitors who have come to try and win her hand in marriage, but really to win the kingdom of Ithaca. By her teenage son, I'm sure that's an experience that people would understand, who gives her a chronically hard time frequently, and by the emotional turmoil of having had her husband away for so many years, and actually not knowing not only when, but if he will return. The suitors strongly make the case that he is dead, and in many ways she presumes that he is. So perhaps unsurprisingly, another thing she's defined by is emotion. She cries a lot. Homeric heroes actually of both genders cry a lot. It's something quite fascinating. Achilles cries all the time. Odysseus himself, the first time we see him in the Odyssey, is crying. But Penelope, I haven't statistically counted this, but I think she sheds the most tears. But she doesn't give up. And so another kind of driving trait, is her steadfastness. And she kind of does whatever she can, both to keep herself together, but also to keep the household together, however dark the picture might look. So that is, in a sense, and that is in Homer, that all the words, sung words, read words, spoken words, to describe Penelope in that way are there. You can probably hear a but.
Well, we'll come to the but in a moment. But Tom, when we look at the Penelope, the traditional Penelope, her virtues aren't so much virtues for women in the modern world, in a sense. The patience, the waiting, the weaving, the household. So were there challenges in bringing that kind of character to life?
Well, I said she speaks for herself, and she's not an apologetic sort of soul. She's actually pretty tough. Her role, or her fate, if you like, is, as it were, delineated by the culture she lived in. And as you said earlier, she has the role of being wife and mother, and the men go and do the fighting and the farming. I didn't at all feel that was some kind of restriction on how one might deal with her. In any event, I was actually concerned to deal with her in her own context rather than in mine. And I think it would be interesting to be subsequently to be berated over a drink next door by half the women in this room for the way Penelope hasn't been, as it were, reinvented. I really don't know whether I did invent her. I didn't mean to. And I certainly didn't want to reinvent her.
And did you go back to the Odyssey before you embarked on writing this?
Yes, I did. Actually, the one I've read most recently, Emily Wilson's
Oh, she's a wonderful translator, yeah.
Somebody told me she was the first woman to translate the Odyssey. Is that right?
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes, in Anglophone culture, first woman, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's become quite a celebrated translation, but I'd read at least a couple of earlier ones, a good American one as well. So I was just, as it were, refreshing myself with the original. I mean, obviously I'm talking about a translation. I did do Greek at school, but only until I left at the age of 17. So I've completely lost that.
I can recommend using a parallel text, and then you can pretend you're reading the Greek while reading the... It's how I got through university.
I think that's very, very good advice.
Now let's get on, Emily, to your but. So you've given us the conventional view of Penelope in Homer, but there's a lot more going on under the surface, isn't there?
Well, actually, and based on what you just said there, Tom, it's not so much a but, really, but also an and. And I very much agree that there are ways of celebrating Penelope in the Odyssey and now without turning her into something that she's not. And she was already a legend, as it were. She was already famous in the Odyssey. When Odysseus is still wandering, he hears stories about her. And there's an amazing simile, which maybe in the translation, it doesn't quite, any translation, I think Emily does this very well, but she's compared to a famous king, and the word, a king with fame, and the word used for fame in Greek is kleos, and that's never applied to women in ancient literature, but it's applied to Penelope via a male, but it's there. So I think actually the fact that she was already celebrated in the Odyssey gives us ammunition to celebrate her now, and she was very much celebrated for those virtues that I talked about. The and, though, is that there are other aspects that I do think always present themselves upon a close reading of the Odyssey, that they never undermine, I think that's quite important, they never undermine that portrait for which Penelope is celebrated and should be within the culture of her time, as you say, but they run alongside it. And for me, there are kind of three, I often think of them as troubling aspects, but I think more kind of puzzling aspects, I suppose I call them. And the first one is the fact that she does speak so much for herself. And one tendency that people tend to do when they're trying to think through these incredible female characters that you find all over ancient literature is to talk about how silent they are. But Penelope is not silent at all, as you say. She very much speaks for herself. But she's often, well, at least there are attempts to silence her. So a famous example is Telemachus, her teenage son, tells her, in effect, to shut up and go back inside. And there's so many cases in which she's spoken about, hence her fame has reached beyond her, rather than spoken to. So there might be a tension there between someone who has such a voice and uses it, but who perhaps isn't always given the space to do so. So silence versus empowerment has always been something that's challenged me. The second one is yes, she's famed even in the ancient world for her wisdom, and that's celebrated. But there's a fine line between wisdom and cunning and trickery. And we kind of go along the spectrum there, and the same too is in the Greek. Wisdom's great, cunning's okay, trickery maybe not so much, particularly in a woman, given the culture. And Penelope's weaving trick that we might talk more about, the fact that she even tricks Odysseus himself in terms of, I think I put it in my summary, she tell him that someone's moved their marital bed, which is impossible because the bed is made out of a tree and is literally rooted to the ground, and he flips out, so he falls for the trick. It's great that she tricks the suitors, but she tricks her own husband, and her husband is the superstar trickster in the whole of the ancient world.
Yes, Polytropos Odysseus.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which Emily Wilson translates as complicated, this word polytropos, but it means something to do with the turnings of his mind. So are they the perfect couple? There's a Greek word called homophrosyne, one-mindedness, because they're both so smart / cunning, or is there actually, does she try to out Odysseus in a way, and is that difficult? And then the third one is, yes, she's very loyal, but that loyalty is sometimes not quite as set in stone as we might think. She never actively flirts with the suitors in Homer, but she does dress up for them under the influence of Aphrodite, but still. There's also a famous dream that she talks to when Odysseus is in disguise as the beggar, and she says, my geese, who are the suitors in this dream, they were killed by an eagle. And that's great. Odysseus is going to come back as the eagle and kill the geese. Great. But then she says, but I wept and wept and wept because my geese were killed. If the geese are the suitors, what on earth do we do with that? So those sort of ands, I think they're the ands to Penelope, not the buts, but they're aspects that we have to bear in mind, I think.
That is really intriguing. And does more lie behind, do you think, the idea of her dressing up for the suitors?
I mean, as ever, like you say, can we get Penelope wrong? As ever, I do think that's completely, as it sounds like a cop-out, completely open for interpretation. Like her dream, she actually says in her dream, she says, well, dreams are tricky things, they can deceive. And in some ways, the fact that Homer does say that Aphrodite dolls her up, and that taps into a huge thing in Homer about when a god makes a mortal do something, do they have no control? Or is the god in some ways a bit of a metaphor for what's going on in that character's mind? And that's a whole school of thought that the ancients were very interested in as well, called double determination. If a hero is pulled back by a god from killing someone, is that almost a metaphor in Homer for the hero actually having second thoughts? So we could play that into, is there a sense to which she wants to dress up for them?
And Tom, what do you think that her attitude, or do you explore her attitude towards the Trojan War and the war that has taken her husband away, and all for the sake of another woman, for Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world?
I took it upon myself to invest Penelope with a certain amount or degree of resentment against Helen, because I felt that she would, and perhaps I am slipping into my own cultural context now, but I felt that she would resent, as it were, becoming famous for staying at home, loyally, quietly, waiting for the man to come back. Helen, well, you will hear in due course, was the sort of Bridget Bardot figure in this. And by the way, the piece does have anachronisms in it of that nature. I'm reminded again that she was actually remembered for her intelligence as much as for her homebody virtues. People are pretty consistent about her as an intelligent being, and in the story, she has to be pretty kind of inventive to survive, and more than survive. So I think she comes through as an admirable woman. And I'm happy to say that it works as a romantic love story as well as all the other ways in which it works. It does, well, this is too complicated. Listen, we don't even know when the Odyssey finished as a piece of writing, because it appears to, there's a natural and, for us, satisfactory end when they're reunited and they're back in bed. But then how interesting that we use the plural personal pronoun now for Homer in every possible sense. Homer added there, meaning his, extra curve in the story. But for me, it does end as a wonderful adventure romance. From his perspective, especially, it's an adventure romance. And it ends with them in each other's arms. I'm quite pleased and traditional about it.
Well, this is a wonderful moment of ancient and modern readings lining up, that there was a large school of thought in antiquity, in the Library of Alexandria, the scholars that worked on sort of creating what was said to be the kind of main manuscript of Homer when it was put into written form. And a sort of scholar called Aristarchus strongly believed that the real ending of the Odyssey was exactly that moment, them being in bed together, Odyssey 23. And we have Scholia Marginalia from Aristarchus that says this is the correct ending. And so, as you say, the curve of Odyssey 24, where Odysseus fights again, he ends with this monstrous roar, he leaves Penelope's arms, he has this really messy skirmish at the end, Penelope's not in it. They think that is not Homer. For what it's worth, I think it really, really is. And it's so Homer, whatever we mean by Homer, to do that curve. But the idea of that being the kind of novelistic romance closure has its roots in the ancient world as well.
And the story so intrigued people in later antiquity is that it carried on, didn't it, beyond the end of the Odyssey, almost like kind of desperate Netflix producers trying to find another season. There's the telegony, isn't there, which I hadn't known about. Tell us what happens there.
Well, we often tend to think that reception is something inherently modern as classics, but actually the reception of Homer started with the Odyssey, if we think of it as the reception of the Iliad, and the reception of the Odyssey started, immediately and completely carried on. And there's this amazing later epic, part of what's called the epic cycle. And this was probably, the dating is complicated, at least the 6th century BC, or at least 200 years, if not more, after the original Homeric epic. And it's called the telegony. And what happens there is it's told, the hero is Odysseus' son that he never knew he had by Circe, when he was trapped by Circe. And so it's all about Telegonus. And Odysseus, which he does tell Penelope when they're having their pillow talk, he says he's going to have to leave again because it was prophesied that his homecoming, he will have to go, and there'll be various new adventures he has to have. Tiresias prophesied that to him. And Odysseus duly does go in this telegony, this fan fiction sequel. And he meets Telegonus, but they don't recognise each other because they've never met, because he didn't know Circe was pregnant. Telegonus, he eats Telegonus's cattle. Funny about thinking about how Odysseus' comrades died. They ate the sun god's cattle. He eats Telegonus' cattle. Telegonus kills him because he thinks he's a random intruder. So very, very like Greek tragedy, incidentally, the kind of mistaken identity realised too late. Telegonus realises what happened, devastated, brings Odysseus' corpse back to Ithaca, where Telegonus marries Penelope.
Isn't that
I'm just going to leave that there.
Sequel?
What we do with
I
that.
love that. It's so amazing. Well, you can see how all the different strands have intrigued writers and down through the generations. And just tell us a little bit more about how the character of Penelope has been seen in art over the ages.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's unsurprisingly, as you sort of said, Tom, because she has such a strong voice already, embodying her, giving her a voice, giving her new voices, she's been a huge muse throughout the generations in antiquity and beyond. But one of the most famous, kind of an image that you tend to always see, if you kind of Google Penelope, as it were, is this one. Which I think is quite, excuse the pun, illustrative of one way in which she's been thought of. This is in 1912. It's by John William Waterhouse, one at a very late stage of his career. And what it clearly depicts is the weaving scene. So Penelope, and this is in my summary, but just a very short version, to keep the suitors at bay, she says, well, I can't marry any of you until I finish weaving the shroud for my father-in-law Laertes. And every night she unpicks what she's done. So the idea that the task could last forever until they catch her in the act and force her to finish it. So this is her weaving. And you can see on the right-hand side, there are some of the suitors. And it opens up as many questions as it answers as a depiction, really. She's super focused on her task. She's the central axis here, clearly. The suitors, I mean, yeah, they could be fawning after her, but they also kind of look a bit bored, especially that one on the outside. Yeah. And why would they be bored? Are they bored because they've been trying to woo her for so long? Because they kind of know...
They have been waiting for a while.
For a long time. Yeah. Or is it all a bit of a game to them anyway, maybe? And she's not looking at them, nor is she looking at the two women who presumably are her maids. There are maids in the Odyssey, we might come back to that later, very silent characters. But Penelope's the central focus here. Odysseus isn't even in it. And the relationship with the outside world as well. I mean, there are lots of sort of beautiful towers there, which isn't really what Odysseus' Ithaca is known to be, quite a rugged place. So is that kind of what the kingdom could be if Odysseus returns? Is it a sign that Penelope she's doing this weaving trick to try and protect the kingdom, but she's also inside. She's kind of neglecting it. So loads of layers there, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And the weaving is so interesting. I mean, Tom talking about Penelope's intelligence, and what I really love is the fact that she's using something that was so central to female identity. Weaving was such an important part of women's life, and she's using that and subverting it in order to survive.
Oh, completely. And what you said about her being as renowned for her intelligence as she was for her kind of domesticity, weaving in the ancient world became actually a metaphor for intelligence, and particularly female intelligence. Helen weaves, make that what you will. In the Iliad, she weaves a tapestry as well of the Trojan War. So it's actually a sort of a form of intelligence, the idea of it being very, very technical, craftsman-like, creative. It also became sort of a way of thinking about creative art in general. So thinking about, again, why Penelope is a muse, in the sort of Victorian period, the connections between weaving as a way of telling a story, basically. And, this artist is telling a story with Penelope, who's weaving as part of the story.
Yes, so. Quite a romantic image. And tell us about other interpretations.
Well, so in some ways, I think it has a lot of layers to it, but it's quite narrative in a way. It's quite descriptive. It's a particularly central scene, which kind of ties into so many of those traits, positive and negative, that I talked about. One of my other personal favourites, though, is from the literary world, and this is Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad. Anyone who hasn't already read this, I would strongly recommend it. This was... Atwood wrote this in 2005, 20 years, almost the day after she wrote The Handmaid's Tale, which has also had a huge renaissance recently and has been televised. And this is very much, in terms of Margaret Atwood's genre, it's very much a kind of dystopian take on Penelope's story in her own voice. So it's a form of a monologue. Right. It's from Penelope's first-person perspective, and it starts, but she's dead. So she's telling this story from the underworld. She says, the first line is, "Now I'm dead, I know everything."
So does mine. She introduces herself as the shade of Penelope.
The shade. This is interesting because one of the quirks, as it were, with dead people in the ancient world is that they're not only are they invisible, but they technically can't speak. As you know from Odyssey 11, they can't speak until they drink some blood and then they get voice. But Penelope's ghost, in yours and in Atwood, is very chatty. And I think that what Margaret Atwood is doing there is actually playing off this idea that Penelope speaks a lot in the Odyssey, but she's often silenced. And Margaret Atwood's Penelope actually makes a point of this. She says, "I find it really difficult to speak because I can't be understood by humans anymore because I'm a ghost." She is always addressing, and this is very Margaret Atwood, the modern reader. She always says, "I'm not in your world." And so you talked about your anachronisms, Tom, and I think there's a lot of play on anachronism there as well. Penelope sort of speaking to a world that she thinks can't literally understand her, but also they won't share the same references as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Tom, isn't it, how many modern writers have gone back to classical themes. I know you were asked to do so by your friends, but it's we've seen it very recently. Kate Atkinson, Madeline Miller, Natalie Haynes have all taken classical themes, and again there's something very powerful about these archetypes of the people from myth, isn't there? That makes writers want to return to the rich scene.
Well, they're archetypes because they are the fons et origo. I mean, everything since has had that as its background. As you said earlier, we don't really know how many centuries ago Homer's books, possibly 2 authors, possibly many oral tradition authors, but you know, it was, everything comes from the Renaissance, really, and in the Renaissance, these books were rediscovered. It's a really interesting point. It's a good question to ask. I wouldn't know how to answer it, but is that why they're the archetypes, or is their archetypical nature due to a sort of chronology? I think any of us who have even a mild modern interest in the psychological processes must feel that ancient literature and Homer, extremely so, they pluck some chord, rather like the bow which is strung in the story. The ragged old man, when he finally strings this impossibly difficult bow, you'll know the Greek for this, but I don't, but it makes a sound like a homing swallow. And these stories make a sound like a homing swallow for everybody who came after.
That is such a beautiful way of putting that. I love that idea. And the raggedy old man, the man with the bow, I mean, in the interpretations that we've been talking about, I mean, Odysseus hasn't played much of a role, has he?
Yes, and there's a driving irony, I suppose, sorry, just pausing on how, yes, I've never, we were talking about weaving as a metaphor for poetry, but actually the stringing of the bow as well, because it goes straight to the heart, not for the suitors, I suppose, it goes into their neck, but to the heart of those who understand. But there's a kind of an irony to Penelope that she has attracted, the 2 pieces I've put there, they've given her voice, they've embodied her on her own, as it were. Odysseus isn't in the John William Waterhouse piece, and Odysseus is spoken about a lot by Penelope, not in Margaret Atwood's Penelope, not necessarily in straightforwardly positive terms, but she's also defined and defines herself, as it were, in the Odyssey by her relationship with her husband. I talked about this one-mindedness. So this person who has attracted so much singular attention, but is also part of a double act. So another key part of the kind of poetics of Penelope is working out how she and Odysseus slot together and work together. And another one of my favourites, which centralises this relationship, is this one by Prima Ticcio in 1560. So I've been a bit Odyssean with my chronology here, kind of gone backwards and forwards in time. And this takes another central scene, but not a Penelope on her own scene, the exact scene that you were talking about, the perhaps the more romantic big R and small r ending of the Odyssey in Odyssey 23 when they're in bed. And the Homeric scene here is, he says, and after they have taken their fill in lovemaking, they delighted in conversation and each told one another their stories. And Penelope goes first, and she says how she kept the suitors at bay and how much she'd missed him, and how sort of faithful she'd been, how sad she'd been. And Odysseus tells her a selective account of what happened to him. He talks about the toils he suffered and the toils he inflicted on others. He talks about him, the Cyclops, Scylla and Charybdis, some of your excuses before. He doesn't mention Nausicaa, interestingly, at all, even though they didn't have an actual relationship, but they perhaps got on better, as it were, than some of the others. He only says about Calypso that she kept him hostage and she tried to make him her husband, and he promised her so much, even immortality, but he said no, because his heart never swerved, he said. And then Penelope listens, and then they fall asleep in each other's arms. And so this is clearly a depiction of this, as I call it, the original pillow talk moment. But what's quite telling here is that it's depicting Penelope talking. She's gesticulating, she's counting. I mean, what is she counting? The kind of standard interpretation is she's counting the suitors, because that's what she tells him about in the Odyssey. But she could be counting the years he's been gone. She could be counting all of the different women that he'd, at least he told her, that she'd seen. And so, again, the kind of central axis is her. But then what he's doing is fascinating, to kind of bring Odysseus back in. He's interrupting her. He's turning her face towards him. And that's often interpreted as a gesture of intense intimacy, going back to what you said about it being a love story. And that's a kind of an amazing thing about Odysseus and Penelope. For all the ancient context that we need to take seriously, it is a love story. Mm. There is what we would call love there. But it could also be interpreted as quite a controlling act. You know, she is talking here, she is storytelling. And that's not necessarily exclusive with it being an intimate gesture, but there's a physicality there. There's almost the potential violence to her turning her head towards him. He's making it about them, but not about her story. And note, you do have two outside world figures. No one knows who they are, so it's all about them. But I think that comes back to that homophrosyne I was talking about, that one-mindedness. Is it a blessing or is it a curse for them and for her? And I think this image really powerfully leaves us with some of that.
We're about to hear, Tom, your interpretation of Penelope, but just before we get to the performance, tell me how you see the relationship between Penelope and Odysseus and how you portray it in a monologue which is from Penelope's viewpoint.
Well, I think there are two ways of being clever. There's, being intelligent is not quite the same thing as being wise, and she has to use her intelligence to get this far. But above all, for, as it were, the whole journey to succeed in its objective, in its destination, she has to be wise. And so Emma kind of took us to the very brink where Odysseus tells his story, and there's 7 missing years, and essentially Penelope is saying, so tell me about these 7 years. And he says, well, I was on this island.
Yes, if she's so clever and wise, she can count, right?
Yeah, exactly. This beautiful Calypso woman kept me there, but actually, just taking things out of order, the image, the single image, which I think is, the keepable image from the whole book, is the image of Odysseus on Calypso's island.
That's my favourite image in the whole poem.
Snap, click, staring out. All he wants to do is to get back to Penelope, and he's not enabled to do so, and he's on the shore, staring out to sea, looking in vain for the sail that might take him back home. And it takes a long time, and finally Calypso gives up. And more adventures, but home he comes. Everything works out as far as, is it book 23 we're sticking with? And what we have is a picture of Penelope the Wise, and we know why she's known by this epithet.
Yeah. Just to add one final note, if I may, on that poignant first image of Odysseus, that ties into a lot of the things we said about the double reading. Yes, he can't wait to get home, but it's because, and there's one Greek word that Homer says, it's because the nymph's pleasures no longer pleased him. And that one Greek word, ouketi, is interesting, and I think coming back to what Penelope actually knows, there was a time when it did, and when he did stay.
Yes.
Well, you've given us so much richness and room for thought as we move on now to the climax of the evening, which is Hattie Morahan is going to be performing for us the world premiere of Penelope by Sir Thomas Stoppard. Thank you very much indeed, Emma and Tom. Thank you very much.
Let others sing of war and a hero buffeted by fate. I sing of marriage and a marriage bed and the endurance of love. So, Muse, in a breath, I am the shade of Penelope, wife and daughter of kings, familiar of the gods. Zeus himself sired in a wing beat my cousin Helen, Leda's daughter, Miss World, who started the Trojan War that took away my husband for 10 years, and 10 more coming the long way home. Where should I lay my curse? For 20 lost years of housekeeping and chastity, for my name stamped on the pattern of for long-suffering, stay-at-home, faithful wives busy at the loom. Round-heeled runaway Helen of the bee-stung lips and who me eyes, not known for her weaving, knitting or needlework, kept her fame and title, the world's most beautiful woman, though her wake was red with Greek and Trojan blood. When Menelaus caught up with her, she only had to drop a shoulder strap to be forgiven. Flashing a breast as round as the golden apple, Paris awarded Aphrodite in return for plain sailing with the beauty queen of Sparta. Should I curse Paris, the wife-stealer? Or Helen, the bolter? Or Aphrodite, who pimped her for him? Dare I curse the primum mobile godfather Zeus, who swanned past Leda's defences and begat the slut? Before she was done with her hoop and hobby horse, word spread like honey on an ant heap. There was a new girl in town. From her ponytail to her gold-strapped sandals, she had the glow of a goddess and a bottom like a cleft peach. Every chancer with an estate and title to his name came wooing, haggling for her mortal father's favour. The high-born lord of Ithaca, rich in land and treasure, came among them. Now it was that he, subtle-minded Odysseus, spoke up. Let Helen choose her husband, he said, and let the rest swear to abide by her choice and to stand up for her husband's rights. Thus he set the snare that would catch him, and catch our best and bravest. Thus they swore, and swore again when Helen chose that shouter Menelaus for his chestnut curls. Thus black-browed Odysseus turned aside, and his eye fell on the homespun daughter of King Icarius. I was the most blessed of brides, and the happiest, raised up to sit at the side of a just ruler over the loveliest islands in all Greece, and to lie at his side, too. When my husband came home from hunting, with a young deer on his broad shoulder, his dog, Argus, at his heels, remember the dog, and his blood hot from the chase, he would have me undress him and empty a pitcher over his steaming back, his breast, his hard thighs, and serve him till I was sated. Now, in a court inside our palace, there grew a long-leaved olive tree with a bole as thick as a pillar, and around it skillful, expert Odysseus, with a sure touch, built our bedroom of tight-set stone, and roofed it over, and fitted neatly joined double doors. Next he lopped the olive's crown and the branches from the roots up, trimmed the trunk, planed it smooth, rounded it, and with his shaping axe head trued it to the plumb line to be our first bedpost. This he drilled through for the supports to complete our marriage bed. and he fashioned inlays of ivory, silver, and gold for decoration before fixing straps of gleaming purple oxhide across the frame. When that was done, he put sheep's wool fleeces and blankets and brightly coloured coverings on the bed. And then he put me on the bed. And everything he did was skillful and expert and with a sure touch. Our firstborn Telemachus was at the breast when the gods could no longer hold back their sport. Their laughter pealed like thunder when the messenger came from Menelaus. His queen had gone and left no note, but it was the Trojan prince, Paris, who had taken her. It was war. My godlike husband took my face between his workman's hands, and these are the words he spoke for my comfort. It will be over by the feast of the shortest day. But just in case, if I'm not back when our son is grown to manhood, marry again, because I'll be dead. In the bloody-fingered dawn, I clothed noble Odysseus in a double cloak of purple wool, pinned with a gold brooch in the form of a hound tearing a fawn in its forepaws. So it was, to keep his vow, he summoned men under his command from Ithaca and the nearer islands, and in 12 ships with crimson-painted bows, he brought them to join the black-hulled fleet assembled at Aulis. More than 1,000 shiploads of fighting men embarked to Troy, to save the honour of a husband who couldn't keep his trophy wife. And they'd be there still, but for Odysseus, lord of stratagems, and his wooden horse. So it was, Odysseus set sail with the fleet for the 10-year siege of the village vamp. When the news was of victory, my tears of thanksgiving slowly dried as the black ships returned one by one, but none to Ithaca. How my wanderer dawdled on his way. So it went. 10 years after the sack of Troy, Penelope, constant queen of Ithaca, rose from her narrow cot each bloodshot dawn, and through eyes sleepless with tears, searched the horizon for the sail that would bring the last man home from the war, though the battlefield was under the plough, and the citadel of Ilium a wilderness for wild pigs. My soul cried out, Odysseus! Odysseus, leader of men, lord of my hearthstone and marriage bed, my comfort, my rapture, my dear son's nearer father, bastard! What are you doing all this time? For 3 years, his name flickered like a moth in travellers' tales and rumour, in songs woven from moonbeams by roaming minstrels who sang of one-eyed giants who snacked on sailors, of the 6-headed monster Scylla, of witches with spells to turn men into swine, and sweet-voiced sirens with hair like sea foam falling over their breasts, of an island where a magic fruit made men forget their home and family. Then for 7 long years, nothing. As though the bones of resourceful Odysseus were long picked clean and rolling in the salt sea waves. My son was grown to manhood. My father Icarius called me widow. My house was loud with all the brutes and boors of Ithaca forcing their suits for my hand in marriage, feasting on my cattle, my flocks, carousing, gaming, debauching my servant girls, and clamouring for me to choose a husband. I had only my guile and my loom to help me. I told my suitors I would choose, as soon as I had finished weaving the fine-spun shroud I was in honour bound to make for the old father of Odysseus. For many months I wove all day, and at night unwove as much again. In this way I held them off until my secret was betrayed. Their fury was like babies denied the breast. Dawn, fetid and bloody-fingered, brought the new day. Then, at last, I bowed my head to the command of far-seeing Odysseus. Now there came a beggar to the palace gate. An old man dressed in rags, leaning on his staff. I watched from above as the swineherd Eumaeus led the stranger into the courtyard. Lying there in the dirt was Argus, the old hunting dog, trained when he was young by his master Odysseus. Argus pricked his ears and wagged his tail. He tried to move, but in the next moment death took him. I had no breath, no heartbeat. My flesh was cold, my eyes blind. Thus my body spoke to my mind. There was some trickery here too deep for me to plumb. I came down into the great hall, where Eumaeus took the vagrant to beg for scraps from the rowdy mob of louts who were my suitors. I sat down in my place by the fire and called for a chair to be brought for the stranger. And I asked him his name and the name of his city. "My lady," he replied, "I am a man of many sorrows. My name is Nobody. Ask me no more. But I met your husband, noble Odysseus, once, when he was on his way to Troy. A gale drove his ship inshore, and I sheltered him and his men until the weather settled." There was more, but any liar could say as much. I asked him then to tell me what clothes my husband was wearing, and the old man answered me, "I remember a thick purple cloak, pinned with a gold brooch, superbly fashioned as a hound with its quarry, a fawn held between its paws." Now I wept, and wept double when he told me to dry my tears, for Odysseus, he said, was alive, and not far away. He had lost his last ship and his crew in a tempest, and for a long time was marooned on an island where his heart broke with longing for me. At length he got away on a raft, but the angry sea god Poseidon sent a great wave to smash it to pieces, and brave Odysseus was in the water for 3 days before he was washed up on a friendly coast, the only man left alive from the 12 ships that had set out from Ithaca. I called for the stranger's feet to be washed by ancient Eurycleia, who had nursed my poor husband and brought him up. Eurycleia came, and she said to the old man how he reminded her of Odysseus. His voice, his glance, even his feet. The old man answered her, "Everyone who saw us both says the same, that we are very like." It was so. My body sang the likeness. Again I warned myself, the gods are at play here, tormenting me for their cruel amusement. My husband will never come home. After the washing of his feet, I turned to my guest with these words, "Friend, I need your wisdom. You see here more than 100 men from Ithaca and round about, all eager to marry me. My son implores me to let one of them take me away as his wife, before the rest eat and drink his patrimony of cattle and sheep, and the stored jars of wine. So I have prepared for the black day by devising a test, with my hand in marriage as the prize. There is a rare bow kept by Odysseus, not for war, but for the chase, and it is here, in the palace. The test will be to string the bow and shoot an arrow straight through the rings of 12 axes in a line, and the man who succeeds can take me home. Or should I hold out? The faithful guardian of my husband's estate, with all his servants, his possessions, and this great high-raftered house. Should I hold out or deliver myself to one of my lecherous suitors?" "Lady," the man with no name replied, "the suitors are already dead. But go ahead with your test. Odysseus will be here long before they have given up making fools of themselves, trying to string the great bow." So long as memory lives in us in the dark plain of asphodel, I will not forget the stringing of the bow. My slapstick heroes, urged on by Telemachus, groaned and sweated and swore to no avail, passing the great bow of Odysseus one to another. And how they raged and jeered when my proud vagabond asked to have his turn. Now I raise my voice in the uproar. Gallant men of Ithaca, are you afraid that this beggar man will spoil your dinner by carrying me off to be his wife? Noble Telemachus, his father's son, spoke up. Mother, he said, there is no Greek with more right than I to give the bow to any man I wish, so go back to your loom and spindle, which are women's work, and take all your women with you. This bow is men's business, and I am master here. I obeyed, no more nor less than a mother need obey a son. From the shadow and the turn of the stairs, I spied on the assembly as Eumaeus placed the great bow in the stranger's hands. He looked it over carefully, twisting it this way and that, bending first one end and then the other. Without strain, calmly, like a singer fixing the sheep-gut to his lyre, he strung the bow, and with his right hand he plucked a note like a homing swallow. In the instant there was a roll of thunder, as though mighty Zeus were growling at me for forgetting my place in the scheme, and I fled to my room, where I sobbed for my beloved husband until Athene closed my eyes in blessed sleep. Never was such a night of reckoning slept through. Before dawn, the credulous old nurse came to get me up, cackling and crowing with her news. My husband was home. He was none other than the beggar, altered and aged by Athene of the shining eyes, the better to plan his overthrow of the impudent suitors. Telemachus was in on it, sworn to keep silent, and the suitors, arrow-shot or put to the sword, were all dead, along with 12 serving girls who had made love to them, hanged in a row by my son. So she spoke. Eurycleia, you have lived a long time, I told her, but you will never understand the humours of the immortal gods. One of them has killed the suitors, and my husband is lost forever. But let's go down and see. The great hall was scrubbed clean, and tables and benches polished. The air smelled of sulphur and purifying fires. I sat down in the firelight against the wall. Odysseus was sitting by a pillar opposite, his eyes on the ground. I didn't know what to think. I looked at his face, and sometimes it was him, and sometimes I didn't know him from a beggar in filthy rags. Telemachus came forward now with harsh words for his mother's silence, but I was numb. I don't know how much time passed. Bright-eyed Athene must have spun the wheel. When I looked again, there was no ragged beggar to be seen. But Odysseus was sitting where he'd sat, bathed and oiled, wearing a lovely tunic and cloak, his body strong, and his hair thick as clustered petals on a hyacinth in flower. He looked like a god. So I waited. He spoke. What an amazing woman you are, to keep yourself aloof when your husband has returned from 20 years of hardship. So, nurse, make me up a bed to sleep alone, for my wife has a heart of iron. Finally, I was able to reply. And what an amazing man. This is not pride or haughtiness. I remember only too well how Odysseus looked when he set out from Ithaca in his long-oared ship. So, Eurycleia, open up the bedroom that Odysseus built, and have the great bed moved out and made up with fleeces and blankets for him to sleep in. It was the test that would prove him false or true. At once he flew into a rage. Wife, he said, your words are a knife to the heart. Who has moved my bed, which I built with my own hands? Only an earth-shaking God could shift it from its place. There was a long-leaved olive tree growing there. I built stone walls around it and a roof over to keep the secret of our marriage bed. For the first bedpost, I lopped the crown off the tree, trimmed the trunk from the roots up, smoothed it, trued it straight, and drilled it through to fix the frame, and so constructed the whole bed, which I decorated with inlays of ivory, silver, and gold. Now what I want to know is, does my bed stand firm? Or has someone cut through the bowl to move it? Oh, how I hurled myself into his arms then, weeping on his neck and kissing his face. Odysseus, I cried, forgive my cautious heart. I always feared that some trickster would appear and deceive me with his story, even an impostor fashioned in your form by the mischievous gods. So don't be angry with me, you who always understood everything. The secret of our marriage bed was ours alone, and it has proved you, my husband, my lord, my beloved. Odysseus wept and held me tight. In tears we outdid each other in forgiving, until torch-bearing, bright-eyed Athene, in the likeness of the housekeeper, lit our way to our room and unlocked the neatly fitted double doors. There she left us. We lay down on our good old bed, and while the goddess held back the coming day, we wove together the threads of time broken when the fleet sailed and Troy burned, and the wanderer made his perilous voyage home. In the fresh and rosy-fingered dawn, when we had loved and talked our fill, I asked my lord, and what of the 7 long years when you were a castaway on that island? My husband replied, it was the island of the nymph, Calypso, who fell in love with me and offered to make me immortal in return. I asked no more, but went to sleep in his arms. May Penelope the wise be my fame and title, and so tell your children, and so farewell.